In the spring of 1944, a seemingly innocuous cartoon appeared in several underground newspapers circulating through Nazi-occupied France. The illustration showed a cheerful baker delivering bread to smiling customers, a simple scene of everyday life meant to provide a moment of lightness amid the grimness of occupation. Children would have smiled at the friendly characters. German censors, had they bothered to examine it closely, would have seen nothing threatening in its wholesome imagery. But hidden within the innocent lines of that cartoon, encoded in the precise placement of objects, the number of bread loaves visible, the positioning of the baker's hands, and the specific expressions on the customers' faces, was an assassination order. Somewhere in occupied France, a resistance cell received instructions to eliminate a specific Gestapo officer whose identity was spelled out in the cartoon's visual code. Within 2 weeks, that officer was dead, killed in what appeared to be a random street robbery. The cartoon that had seemed so harmless had carried a death sentence, and no one except the intended recipients ever knew. This is the hidden story of how propaganda and murder intersected in World War II, how innocent imagery became the vehicle for deadly orders, and how cartoons transformed from entertainment into weapons. Welcome to Cipher Tales, where we decode the hidden secrets of World War II at the intersection of propaganda and espionage. Today, we reveal one of the war's most ingenious and disturbing communication methods: the use of editorial cartoons and illustrations in underground newspapers to transmit coded orders for resistance operations, including assassinations, sabotage, and intelligence gathering. This wasn't simply about hiding messages in pictures. It was about creating a communication system so sophisticated that it could specify targets, timings, methods, and authentication codes, all within drawings that appeared to be nothing more than morale-boosting entertainment for occupied populations. Every cartoon published in the resistance press was potentially a military order disguised as art, and the artists who created them were as much intelligence operatives as the agents who executed the orders they contained. The story begins with the underground press itself, that remarkable network of illegal newspapers, pamphlets, and leaflets that flourished throughout occupied Europe despite German efforts to suppress it. In France alone, by 1943, there were over 1,000 clandestine publications circulating, ranging from single-page flyers produced on hidden printing presses to substantial newspapers with national distribution networks. These publications served multiple purposes. They countered German propaganda, maintained French morale, coordinated resistance activities, and provided news that the German-controlled official press wouldn't report. The Germans understood the threat these publications represented and devoted significant resources to tracking down editors, printers, and distributors. Possession of underground newspapers was a serious crime that could result in imprisonment, deportation to concentration camps, or execution. Yet the underground press continued to grow and reach hundreds of thousands of readers throughout the occupation. Within this underground press ecosystem, cartoons and illustrations played important roles from the beginning. They broke up dense text, making newspapers more visually appealing and easier to read under the difficult conditions that characterized clandestine reading. They provided propaganda value, mocking German occupiers and Vichy collaborators while celebrating resistance heroism. They communicated ideas to less literate readers who might struggle with complex written arguments. And crucially, they were easier to remember than text, important in situations where newspapers might need to be destroyed quickly, but information needed to be retained and passed along verbally. But what the Germans never fully understood, despite their suspicions, was that some of these cartoons served another purpose entirely. They were coded orders from resistance leadership to operational cells in the field. The development of cartoon-based coding systems was a natural evolution of resistance communication methods. Traditional communication channels were extremely vulnerable. Radio transmissions could be detected and located.
Courier networks could be infiltrated and compromised. Written orders, if discovered, provided clear evidence of resistance activity and specific operational plans. But a cartoon in an underground newspaper had plausible deniability built in. If a resistance member was caught with such a newspaper, they could claim they were simply reading news or looking at entertainment. The cartoon itself, even if analyzed by German intelligence, would appear to be exactly what it seemed: political satire or morale-boosting illustration. Only those who possessed the specific cipher keys needed to decode the cartoon would understand its true message.
The coding systems used in resistance cartoons were remarkably sophisticated and drew on several cryptographic principles adapted for visual media. Positional encoding was fundamental. The placement of objects within the cartoon's frame carried meaning according to prearranged coordinate systems. A character positioned in the upper left quadrant might indicate one type of operation, while the same character in the lower right would indicate something entirely different. The number of objects depicted was another encoding method. 5 loaves of bread versus 7 loaves could distinguish between different targets or different operational timings. The direction that characters faced, whether looking left or right, up or down, encoded additional information. Facial expressions, hand positions, and body language all carried potential meaning to those trained to decode them. Color usage, when publications could afford color printing or when hand coloring was possible, provided another encoding layer. A character wearing a red shirt versus a blue shirt could indicate different operational priorities or different authentication codes. The background elements of cartoons, easily dismissed as artistic filler, often contained crucial information. The number of windows in a building, the types of trees visible, the presence or absence of clouds in the sky. Every visual element was potentially significant, and the artists creating these cartoons worked from detailed specifications provided by resistance intelligence officers, who designed each cartoon as carefully as any written order. The artists themselves were extraordinary individuals who combined artistic talent with intelligence training and nerves of steel. Many were professional illustrators, cartoonists, or graphic designers before the war, who had been recruited into resistance work specifically because of their skills. Others were amateurs who had discovered they had talent for drawing and were developed as assets by resistance organizations. These artists received training in the coding systems they would use, learning how to encode specific types of information into their drawings while maintaining the appearance of normal editorial cartoons. They had to be good enough artists that their work would be believable as legitimate cartoons, avoiding any awkwardness or unusual compositions that might draw attention. But they also had to be precise enough to ensure that every encoded element was exactly where it needed to be for accurate decoding. The creation process for a coded cartoon began with an operational need identified by resistance leadership. An assassination might be ordered for a particularly brutal Gestapo officer. A sabotage operation might be planned against a railway junction. Intelligence might need to be gathered about German troop movements. Whatever the operation, it needed to be communicated to the specific resistance cell responsible for carrying it out. A resistance intelligence officer would determine what information needed to be transmitted: target identity, location, timing, method, authentication codes, and any special instructions. This information would then be encoded using the cipher system that the intended recipient cell had been trained in. Different cells often used different cipher systems, providing additional security, since even if one cell was compromised and their cipher revealed, other cells would remain secure. The encoded information would be given to the artist along with general parameters for the cartoon. It should appear to be about daily life under occupation, or it should mock a specific aspect of German occupation policy, or it should celebrate some aspect of French resistance or history.
The artist would then create a cartoon that incorporated all the required encoded elements while also functioning as effective propaganda or entertainment. This dual requirement made the work extraordinarily challenging. A cartoon that was too obviously designed around encoding specific information might not work well as propaganda and might even raise suspicions. But a cartoon that prioritized artistic or propaganda considerations over accurate encoding would fail in its primary mission of communicating orders. The best cartoon coders were those who could seamlessly integrate both functions, creating images that were genuinely clever or moving as propaganda, while also carrying precise hidden instructions. Once created, the cartoon would be incorporated into an underground newspaper along with regular content, news articles, editorials, announcements, and other propaganda materials. The newspaper would be printed, often under dangerous conditions in hidden locations, and distributed through the resistance network. Distribution itself was perilous work, with couriers risking arrest and execution every time they transported bundles of illegal newspapers. But the advantage of embedding orders in published cartoons was that distribution could use the same channels as regular underground press distribution, providing cover and eliminating the need for separate, potentially more vulnerable, courier systems for operational orders.
The decoding process required training, tools, and secure conditions. Resistance members who had been designated to receive and decode orders would obtain copies of the relevant underground newspapers through their cell's distribution network. In a safe location, typically a hidden room in a private residence or a remote rural location, they would examine the cartoons that had been flagged as containing coded messages. The flagging system itself was often coded, perhaps cartoons on specific pages, or cartoons with specific stylistic markers, or cartoons from particular known artists. Using memorized cipher keys and sometimes simple tools like rulers or transparent overlays with grid patterns, the decoder would systematically extract the hidden information from each visual element of the cartoon. A typical decoding session might work like this. The decoder identifies a cartoon containing orders by recognizing a specific stylistic signature that had been prearranged. They measure the precise position of the main character from the edges of the cartoon frame, converting these measurements into coordinate values that correspond to a location on a memorized or hidden map. They count the number of specific objects in the scene, each number corresponding to a different operational element, date, time, method, or target characteristic. They note the direction the character is facing, which indicates the type of operation. Facial expressions are checked against a prearranged chart that links expressions to specific targets or situations. Background elements are analyzed for additional details. Gradually, through systematic analysis of every encoded element, the complete operational order emerges. Assassinate a specific Gestapo officer at a specific location on a specific date using a specific method with authentication provided by a specific code phrase. The security of this system relied on multiple layers of protection. First, only trained members of resistance cells with the appropriate cipher keys could decode the cartoons. Second, even if Germans suspected that cartoons contained hidden messages, analyzing them without the cipher keys would be nearly impossible given the number of potential encoding methods and the individuality of each cell's cipher system. Third, the plausible deniability of the cartoons meant that even if resistance members were caught with newspapers containing coded cartoons, proving that they had decoded orders versus simply reading propaganda was extremely difficult. Fourth, the use of published media meant there was no direct link between sender and receiver of orders, unlike radio or courier systems where communication channels could be traced. The types of orders transmitted through cartoon coding varied widely and reflected the full range of resistance operations. Assassination orders were among the most sensitive and required the most precise encoding. The target's identity had to be specified unambiguously, often using a combination of physical description, location, and routine that would allow the assassination team to identify and track their target. The timing of the operation would be encoded to ensure that the team struck when conditions were optimal and when they could most easily escape afterward.
The method might be specified: shooting, staged accident, poisoning, or other means depending on circumstances and available resources. Authentication codes would be included so that if the assassination team needed to make contact with other resistance elements during the operation, they could verify their legitimacy. Sabotage orders transmitted through cartoon coding would specify targets and methods with equal precision. A cartoon might encode the location of a specific railway bridge that needed to be destroyed, the timing of the operation coordinated with other resistance activities or allied military operations, and technical details about explosive placement for maximum effect. Industrial sabotage orders might specify which machines in a factory should be disabled, or which chemicals should be contaminated, or how production should be slowed without creating obvious sabotage that would trigger German retaliation. The advantage of encoding these orders in cartoons rather than transmitting them by radio or courier systems was that the orders could be studied repeatedly by the sabotage team during their planning phase, allowing them to verify details and coordinate their approach without the risk of interception that multiple radio transmissions would entail.
Intelligence gathering orders represented another category of cartoon-coded communication. Resistance cells might be instructed to observe and report on specific German military installations, to track the movements of particular German units, to identify collaborators within French society, or to gather economic intelligence about German exploitation of French resources. These orders would specify what information was needed, where observation should be conducted, how frequently reports should be made, and through what channels the intelligence should be transmitted back to resistance leadership or to Allied intelligence services. The use of cartoons for intelligence gathering orders was particularly valuable because it allowed for complex, detailed instructions that might be difficult to transmit clearly through other covert communication methods. Coordination orders used cartoon encoding to synchronize activities across different resistance cells without the cells needing to communicate directly with each other. A single cartoon might contain encoded information that one cell would interpret as an order to attack a specific target on a specific date, while another cell reading the same newspaper would decode different elements of the same cartoon as an order to create a diversion at a different location at the same time. This allowed for coordinated operations without the security vulnerabilities that would come from cells communicating with each other or from resistance leadership sending separate orders through multiple channels. The beauty of this system was its efficiency. One cartoon, distributed through normal underground press channels, could coordinate complex multi-cell operations while maintaining operational security. The case of the Baker cartoon mentioned at the beginning of this story illustrates how deadly these innocent-looking images could be. The specific Gestapo officer targeted had been identified by resistance intelligence as being particularly brutal in his treatment of arrested resistance members and as being effective in infiltrating and destroying resistance networks. His elimination was deemed operationally necessary. However, communicating an assassination order was extremely risky. The resistance cell capable of carrying out the operation was in Paris, while the resistance leadership making the decision was based elsewhere. Radio communication was too risky for such a sensitive order. A courier carrying written assassination orders would be signing their own death warrant if captured. The solution was the Baker cartoon, carefully designed to encode every detail the assassination team would need. The baker's position in the cartoon indicated the general area of Paris where the target could be found. The number of bread loaves he was carrying specified the day of the month. The time of day for the operation was encoded in the position of the sun in the cartoon's background. The target's physical description was encoded through the characteristics of the customers in the scene. Their heights, clothing colors, and positions corresponded to the target's height, typical clothing, and the locations he frequented. The method of assassination was indicated by the baker's hand position, which matched a prearranged code for shooting. Authentication details were encoded in background elements that only the genuine assassination team would know to look for. The entire operation order, from target identity through method and timing to authentication, was contained in that cheerful scene of a baker delivering bread. The assassination team, receiving their copy of the underground newspaper, decoded the cartoon in a hidden apartment. They spent days planning their operation based on the decoded intelligence, identifying their target through patient observation and waiting for the specified date.
When the moment came, they executed the operation with precision, eliminating the Gestapo officer in what appeared to be a street crime. German investigators never connected the assassination to the resistance, never suspected that orders had been transmitted through published cartoons, and never identified the assassination team. The Baker cartoon was just one of hundreds of similar cases throughout occupied Europe where coded illustrations carried deadly orders that resulted in successful resistance operations.
The German response to underground newspapers focused primarily on suppressing distribution and punishing those involved in production. They certainly suspected that underground publications might contain coded messages, and German intelligence services analyzed many captured newspapers looking for hidden communications. However, their analysis focused primarily on text, looking for acrostics, analyzing word patterns, searching for linguistic anomalies that might indicate codes. The possibility that visual elements, like cartoons, might contain sophisticated operational codes seems to have been less thoroughly investigated, perhaps because analyzing images for hidden codes was more complex and less well-developed as a counterintelligence technique than text analysis. German intelligence had extensive experience with traditional cryptography and could break many text-based codes, but visual cryptography in editorial cartoons was a relatively novel technique that fell outside their standard analytical frameworks. When Germans did focus on cartoons, their concern was typically about their propaganda impact rather than their potential coding functions. Cartoons that mocked German authorities or celebrated resistance activities were seen as dangerous for their morale effects on both the occupied population and on German troops. Efforts were made to identify and arrest cartoonists, not because they were suspected of encoding operational orders, but because their artistic propaganda was considered effective in undermining German authority and encouraging resistance. This misunderstanding of the cartoon's true significance was a persistent German blind spot that the resistance exploited throughout the occupation. The risks for those involved in the cartoon coding system were substantial, despite its security advantages. Artists creating coded cartoons faced death if their true role was discovered. The act of creating these images required them to possess sensitive operational information that would be damning evidence if found. They had to maintain contact with resistance intelligence officers to receive encoding instructions, creating links that could be traced by German counterintelligence. And they had to deliver their finished cartoons to underground newspapers, involving them in the newspaper production and distribution networks that were under constant German attack. Many cartoon coders were arrested during the war, though often their arrests came through general sweeps of underground press networks rather than through specific identification of their coding activities. Decoders faced different but equally serious risks. Possessing the cipher keys necessary to decode cartoons was inherently dangerous. If arrested and interrogated, they might reveal the coding system under torture, compromising not just their own operations, but the entire communication network. The act of decoding itself required secure locations and time, both of which were sometimes difficult to arrange in the paranoid environment of occupation, where suspicious behavior could draw attention. And most dangerously, successful decoding led directly to operational activity, assassination, sabotage, or intelligence gathering that carried its own substantial risks of exposure, capture, and execution. The psychological pressure on both coders and decoders was immense. They carried the weight of knowing that errors could cost lives. An artist who encoded information incorrectly might send an assassination team after the wrong target, or send them into a trap. A decoder who misread a cartoon's message might lead their cell into a German ambush or miss a critical operational opportunity. The stress of this responsibility, combined with the general terror of living under occupation and working in the resistance, took a severe toll. Many participants later described suffering from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares about encoding or decoding errors that led to disasters, even when their actual work had been flawless. The evolution of cartoon coding systems over the course of the war reflected both increasing sophistication and adaptation to German countermeasures. Early systems were relatively simple, using basic positional encoding and number counting. As the underground press grew and as resistance operations became more complex,
the coding systems evolved to handle more information with greater precision. Multiple encoding layers were added, where different visual elements encoded different types of information that had to be combined for complete understanding. Error-checking methods were incorporated, with redundant encoding of critical information to ensure accuracy even if part of the cartoon was damaged or unclear. Dynamic coding was introduced, where the interpretation of certain visual elements would change based on date or based on information in previous cartoons, creating a more secure system that would be nearly impossible for outsiders to decode without access to the full sequence of keys in cartoons. Integration with other resistance communication methods multiplied the effectiveness of cartoon coding. Radio broadcasts from London would sometimes contain alerts that a specific upcoming cartoon would contain important orders, allowing decoders can know which cartoons to focus on. Conversely, cartoon-coded messages might instruct cells to listen for specific radio broadcasts that would provide additional details. Courier networks supplemented cartoon-coded orders with physical materials needed for operations, weapons, explosives, false documents, or more detailed maps and photographs of targets. The cartoon coding system was never intended to work in isolation, but rather as one component of a comprehensive resistance communication network. The contribution of cartoon coding to the overall resistance effort is difficult to quantify precisely, but was undoubtedly significant. Hundreds of successful operations, from assassination through sabotage to intelligence gathering, were coordinated through this system. The security advantages it provided helped protect resistance networks from German counterintelligence penetration. The efficiency of using existing underground press distribution channels reduced the risks associated with maintaining separate operational communication networks. And the psychological impact of knowing that even something as innocent-seeming as a cartoon could be a weapon against the occupiers boosted resistance morale and demonstrated the creativity and determination of those fighting German occupation. After the liberation of France in 1944, many of the artists and intelligence officers involved in cartoon coding continued their work in newly liberated areas or in operations against Germany itself. Some of the techniques developed for resistance cartoons were adapted for use in psychological warfare operations against German forces, with coded cartoons appearing in propaganda materials directed at German soldiers. The fundamental principles of using visual media to encode sensitive information influenced post-war intelligence practices and contributed to the development of more sophisticated visual cryptography techniques used during the Cold War and beyond. The post-war recognition of cartoon coders and decoders was limited, as with so much resistance work. Many participants never publicly discussed their activities, either because the information remained classified or because they preferred to move on from the traumatic experiences of occupation and resistance. Some artists became well known after the war for their work in the underground press, but often their specific role in encoding operational orders remained secret. The full story of cartoon coding in World War II only began to emerge decades later as archives were opened, participants wrote memoirs in their old age, and historians pieced together the fragments of this remarkable communication system. The ethical implications of using cartoons, a medium often associated with children and entertainment, to transmit assassination orders and other deadly instructions, troubled some participants then and continue to provoke thought now. There's an unsettling quality to the idea that an image of a friendly baker delivering bread contained instructions for killing a human being. Yet those involved generally justified their actions by the context of occupation and resistance, by the brutality of the Nazi regime they fought against, and by the necessity of finding secure communication methods that could save more lives than they cost. The cartoon coding system, like much of resistance activity, existed in moral territory that resists simple judgment. The technical achievement represented by cartoon coding systems remains impressive when examined from a cryptographic perspective. creating encoding methods that could convey precise, complex information through visual elements while maintaining the visual coherence and propaganda effectiveness of the cartoons themselves required sophisticated thinking that blended art, mathematics, and intelligence tradecraft. The system's security record, with few, if any, confirmed cases of German forces successfully decoding operational orders from resistance cartoons, suggests that the technical design was sound and that operational security was well maintained by participants. Modern cryptographers and intelligence historians studying these systems have noted their elegance and their relevance to contemporary challenges in steganography and covert communication. This is the hidden story of how World War II cartoons carried deadly orders disguised as innocent entertainment, how resistance artists became intelligence operatives, and how images that made people smile also made them effective weapons against occupation. It's a story that reveals the creativity and determination of resistance movements, the sophisticated intelligence operations that supported them, and the remarkable courage of individuals who used every tool available, even something as simple as a cartoon, to fight against tyranny. The baker delivering bread, the children playing in a park, the workers walking to a factory. These cheerful images that brought moments of lightness to people living under the darkness of occupation sometimes carried within them the seeds of resistance operations that would strike back against that darkness. Every cartoon published in the underground press was potentially more than it seemed, and the Germans never fully understood just how dangerous those innocent drawings really were. If this deep dive into how World War II cartoons carried deadly hidden orders captivated you, please subscribe to Cipher Tales for more decoded mysteries from the hidden history of World War II. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next upload. Like this video if you found it revealing and thought-provoking. Every like helps us reach more people who appreciate the complex, hidden dimensions of history. Comment below and tell us, were you surprised by the sophistication of cartoon coding systems? Can you see connections between World War II visual cryptography and modern steganographic techniques? What other World War II propaganda and espionage intersections should we decode next? The role of forged artwork in intelligence operations? How comic books were used for psychological warfare? The intersection of children's media and resistance communications. Share this video with anyone fascinated by cryptography, resistance history, World War II intelligence operations, or the hidden stories of how ordinary things became extraordinary weapons. Until then, remember, the most innocent images can carry the most dangerous messages. This has been Cipher Tales. Keep questioning, keep decoding, keep discovering the secrets that changed history.